Silence. They mistook it for the end. They thought the quiet meant I was finished, broken, erased. But silence isn't the ending, it's the pause before everything changes. While they cheered for my absence, I wasn't gone. I was just done wasting words on ears too deaf to hear the truth. They wanted noise, they wanted anger, explanation, confession. They wanted me to fight for my place in their stage. But words are cheap, and their world runs on cheap things. I gave them nothing, and in that nothing, they found the one thing they couldn't handle, stillness that stared back at them. Their eyes searched, their voices rose, their laughter sharpened, but it didn't matter. The silence swallowed it all. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to argue. The absence of my words carried more weight than their endless noise ever could. That's what scared them, not my voice, but the fact that I didn't need it anymore. They thought silence meant surrender. They thought it meant I had nothing left to say. But the truth is simpler, colder, sharper. I was done talking because the joke was already written, and they were the punchline. So they called it over. They thought it ended with my silence, but endings only exist in their world, not mine. Silence isn't an end. It's the beginning of their unraveling. They leaned closer, waiting for words that would never come. Their entire world was built on noise, arguments, cheers, accusations, applause. Without it, they were naked. They needed me to explain myself, to defend, to break the silence. But I had already buried words. And in their place, I gave them nothing. That nothing terrified them. They tried to fill the void with their own voices, louder, sharper, emptier. Each shout cracked against the walls like glass and shattered into pieces that meant nothing. They couldn't understand that silence wasn't absence. It was control. Every second I refused to speak, the weight shifted. Their victory sounded weaker. Their laughter rang hollow. Their confidence shook. It was strange to watch. They thought they were winning, thought they had silenced me, but the silence wasn't theirs. It was mine. It spread like smoke, invisible but suffocating. And with every moment they tried to overpower it, they only proved how powerless they really were. Their words, their noise, their desperate chants, it all circled around me, and yet I didn't move. I didn't need to, because silence doesn't chase. Silence waits, and waiting is stronger than all their noise combined. They thought it was over. They thought silence ended the story. But silence doesn't end. Silence begins. And this was only the first chapter. They didn't understand it at first. To them, silence was weakness, the absence of fight. But as minutes bled into hours, the air thickened. Their laughter grew sharper, their movements twitchy, restless. They couldn't admit it, but they felt it. Silence wasn't absence, it was presence, and it pressed against them harder than any scream could. The room bent under it. Their words started colliding with each other, desperate, overlapping, broken. They wanted my reaction, any reaction, to prove they still had control. But control was gone the moment I stopped talking, because once silence enters, it doesn't leave. It grows, it devours, it rewrites the rules. Their victory began to taste bitter. What good is winning if the one you defeated won't even acknowledge the game? What good is a prize if the one you tried to break won't even look at it? Every second I remained still, their prize became lighter in their hands, until it felt like ash. I smiled, not to taunt, not to provoke, just to let them know I was still here, still untouched, still untouchable. That's when they realized the truth. I hadn't lost my voice. I had stolen theirs, and in the echo of silence, they were the ones who couldn't speak. So they told themselves stories, they whispered excuses, they clung to each other like the noise could save them. But nothing saves them now, because once silence owns the room, it never gives it back. They huddled closer, clinging to their noise like children clutching broken toys. Every word they spat felt smaller, weaker, emptier. They thought if they spoke enough, if they laughed loud enough, they could erase the silence pressing in on them. But silence doesn't erase. Silence waits. And waiting is the sharpest blade of all. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just let the weight build. The harder they tried to fill the void, the more obvious it became. The void was inside them now. It stretched across their faces. It trembled in their voices. It cracked their pride. They weren't celebrating a victory anymore. They were begging each other to believe it still mattered. The prize in their hands lost its glow. The applause lost its rhythm. Every attempt to mock me turned into a confession of fear. Because how do you humiliate someone who won't respond? How do you break someone who has already stepped out of the game? That's when their eyes shifted. No longer looking at the prize, no longer looking at each other. They looked at me. The silence drew them in, pulled their attention like gravity, until nothing else in the room existed. Not their win, not their noise, not their fragile illusions. Only me. And that's the truth they'll never speak aloud. The game didn't end when they won. It ended when I stopped talking, and in that end I became the only thing left worth listening to. They waited for my words like beggars wait for scraps. They thought my silence was weakness, a wound waiting to bleed. But silence doesn't bleed, it sharpens. And in that sharpening, I became something they never expected. Not defeated, not broken, transformed. The smile was slow, deliberate. Not joy, not sorrow, just inevitability. They felt it before they saw it. The silence wasn't mine anymore. It wrapped around them, crawled into their lungs, turned their laughter into whispers. They wanted me to fight, to scream, to prove their victory was real. Instead, I gave them nothing. And that nothing was the heaviest answer of all. That's the part they'll never accept. You don't end me by silencing me. You end yourselves when my silence becomes louder than all your noise. That was the moment the game flipped. The moment they realized the ending was just the beginning of their unraveling. I wasn't done because I was broken. I was done because I had outgrown the game, and now, every time they open their mouths, they'll hear it. The silence that follows, the silence that owns them. Subscribe, not for me, not for them, for the void that outlives their noise. Because the moment you stop talking, they start listening. They thought silence was the end of my story. They never realized it was the start of theirs unraveling. Every second stretched longer, every heartbeat thudded louder, and the weight of words unsaid began to crush them. Silence doesn't stay still. It grows, expands, and suffocates. It wasn't absence anymore. It was presence, absolute and undeniable. I didn't have to move. I didn't have to raise a hand or lift my voice. My stillness was the strike. My quiet was the knife. Their faces twitched with unease as if the air itself had turned against them. That's the trick about silence. It doesn't need to fight. It just waits, and waiting is deadlier than rage. They tried to mock me again, voices breaking, laughter fractured. But mockery without confidence is just noise, and noise without power is nothing. I let them choke on it. Every attempt to reclaim control only fed the void that had already claimed them. The more they spoke, the more they revealed how small they truly were. The prize they clung to, the victory they celebrated, it meant nothing now. They knew it. Their eyes darted, searching for reassurance in each other's gaze, but finding only fear reflected back. I wasn't playing anymore, but somehow I was still winning. Because when you remove yourself from the game, you stop losing altogether. And in that moment, they finally understood. Silence isn't retreat. Silence is the highest form of presence. It lingers longer than words, cuts deeper than screams, and leaves scars they'll carry long after I've walked away. They thought they ended me. Instead, I ended their illusion of control. They avoided my eyes at first. Then, without realizing it, they kept coming back to them. Like moths circling a flame they swore they weren't drawn to. That's the poison of silence. It turns attention into obsession. The more they tried to ignore me, the more I became the only thing they could notice. Every breath they took grew shallow, cautious, measured. They didn't want to show it, but their bodies betrayed them. Silence seeped into their bones, their rhythm faltered, and suddenly even standing still became effort. Their victory banner might have been raised, but it hung limp in the air because the weight of silence had smothered the wind itself. I didn't have to speak to remind them I was still here. My presence had already carved itself into their skin, into the room, into the cracks of their fragile certainty. That's what silence does. It brands itself, permanent and unseen, deeper than scars, harder than words. They whispered to each other, desperate to reclaim normalcy. But whispers don't mask fear, they amplify it. And every hushed word was an admission. They weren't mocking anymore. They were confessing that silence had stripped them bare, left them naked in their own weakness. And as I watched, the truth crystallized in their eyes. They hadn't silenced me. I had infected them. I had become the silence they couldn't escape. And once silence takes root, it never leaves. It grows, it spreads, it consumes. The room no longer belonged to them. Their noise, their laughter, their fragile rituals of dominance, all of it had been stripped away. What remained was the gravity of silence, heavy and unyielding, circling them like chains they couldn't see but could feel tightening with every breath. They thought victory would free them, but instead it trapped them inside the void I carried. I didn't need to claim space. Space bent around me. They leaned forward, desperate to predict my next move, but there was no move to predict. That was the real terror. When nothing comes, everything is possible. The unpredictability of silence eats at the mind until fear does the work for you, and fear is always more loyal than respect. Their voices faltered. Even their whispers betrayed exhaustion. Silence wasn't just pressing, it was reshaping them, grinding down their certainty, bending their pride into something brittle. They weren't opponents anymore. They were shadows of themselves, reflections flickering under a weight they couldn't carry. I tilted my head once, barely an acknowledgement, and it was enough to make them stumble over their own words. That's the strength of silence. It doesn't need to roar. It doesn't need to strike. A glance, a pause, a smirk. Those become earthquakes when the foundation of noise is already shattered. By then, they finally understood. Silence wasn't my weapon, silence was me. And once I stopped speaking, I stopped being part of their game. I became the end of it. The walls carried it first. The silence seeped into the cracks, into the dust, into every forgotten corner of the room. It clung to the ceiling, pressed against the floor, turned the air into glass. Breathing became heavier, like dragging chains through smoke. They didn't want to admit it, but even the space around them had surrendered. Their eyes darted in every direction, searching for something, an anchor, a sound, a reason to believe they were still in control. But there was nothing left. Their laughter had died, their voices had broken, and their victory sounded like an echo swallowed whole. Silence had filled the space between us, and now it was the only language spoken. I didn't move, yet the room moved with me. Every glance I gave bent the atmosphere. Every tilt of my smile rewrote the balance. They were no longer fighting me. They were fighting the silence. And that's a war no one wins. Silence doesn't tire. Silence doesn't forget. Silence doesn't forgive. Their fear grew quiet too, no longer wild, no longer loud. It became focused, sharp, precise, the kind of fear that doesn't scream. It listens. And in that listening, they realized the truth. I wasn't waiting for them to break. They were already broken. And as the silence thickened, there was nothing left to hear but their own collapse. No one remembers the noise. No one recalls the victory. What they'll never forget is the weight of silence and the shadow that carried it. They thought silence was weakness. They thought it was surrender. But silence never surrenders. It consumes. Every laugh they forced, every word they shouted, every fragile attempt to own the moment is already gone. All that remains is the memory of stillness, carved into them deeper than any wound. I never needed to speak. I never needed to argue. Noise is for those who beg to be heard. Silence is for those who already own the room. And the room was mine the second I stopped playing their game. They can tell themselves they won. They can clutch their fragile prizes. But in the echo of this silence, they'll never believe it, because silence doesn't need an audience. Silence doesn't chase validation. It stands, it lingers, it haunts, and the longer it lingers, the more it defines everything around it. Their fear, their pride, their defeat, it all bends under the weight of nothing. Nothing louder than every scream they ever had. I didn't end them with rage. I didn't end them with violence. I ended them by becoming the silence they could never control. That silence followed them, crawled into their nights, echoed in their thoughts. They'll hear it long after they've forgotten my face. This isn't an ending. This is permanence. They thought it was over, but the truth is simple. Once silence begins, it never ends.